For the time being, things are going forward for Putin. But when you look at the fundamentals of the Russian economy and the defense economy and what he appears to be getting committed to elsewhere in the great arc of disruption, which seemed to be going terribly well up until a few weeks ago, then I think he's got big problems. He would want to close things off by the end of the year. I don't think he will. I think there will be a peace gesture. I think it will fail. And then we'll be into a new ball game with the new American presidency.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're joined by a defence editor with 55 years' experience as a broadcaster and journalist. Robert Fox has reported from several conflicts, including the Falklands, the First Gulf War and the Balkans. He's worked for the BBC, the Daily Telegraph and authored many books, and he's now the Evening Standard's defence editor. Robert Fox, good to see you again.
Hello.
Robert, Russian flags have been raised over Vuhledar in the Donbas, Russia's biggest gain since February and one they fought for 2 years. How much of a difference does it actually make?
Vuhledar is really a citadel. It's a smallish town, but it has been very, very heavily defended. So the Russians are flagging this up as their biggest victory since taking Advika. Quite important, but it's not as important as other places that they were going for might have been, namely Pokrovsk. Putin is desperate for an autumnal win. He wants to make it clear that he is winning and he's on a roll in this phase of the offensive. They took a psychological blow earlier on with the incursion into Kursk, where the Ukrainians are having a tough time. The advantage is with the Russians, partly because of numbers, partly because of technology, not overmuch, but partly very much because of politics and a change in the international scene.
To what extent will Putin and his military leadership see Vuhledar as vindication, though, for Russia's slow grinding warfare, irrespective of the loss of life? Or will they be hoping for some kind of spectacular breakthrough to force Ukraine into capitulation?
Well, so far on the front line, as you say, in the front formations, the Russians do not seem to have adjusted their doctrine, that is the way they do things, over much. They have changed because, of course, drone, cyber technology, electronic warfare really is kicking in quite an alarming way that I think is taking Western countries by surprise and proving or underlining the inadequacy of their armed forces, particularly the British and to an extent the French. Britain is really in a very sorry state, faced with the kind of developments that we're now witnessing, not only in Ukraine, but also on the multi-front Israel conflict and crisis. But that being said, that it's the position of Zelenskyy, which is so difficult. He's hanging on. He's being very brave against great odds. The extraordinary thing is, to go back to your main question, is why Russia is going on like this. And it's absolutely clear that Valery Gerasimov, the commander-in-chief, is not changing his mind, not changing his ways. And for the time being, Putin is prepared to indulge him. And I stress that because there have been many rumors lately that he may be about to be replaced before the end of the year.
But you don't think that's the case, then?
I think there will be a change, but there is a sort of moving around in the among the Suvliki, the security elite, which keep Putin going. They rely on him; he relies on them, and there are curious figures like Shoigu, who was removed as defense minister, and they put a businessman in his place. But Shoigu is very important. He's very important because of the informal network of power that you get that supports Putin, particularly through militias and militaries. These guys control private armies. And the most glaring case, of course, is Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen, who is very, very close to Putin and more or less supplies his bodyguard. But that is really almost gangster power in Chechnya. So for the time being, things are going forward for Putin. But when you look at the fundamentals of the Russian economy and the defense economy and what he appears to be getting committed to elsewhere in the great arc of disruption, which seemed to be going terribly well up until a few weeks ago, then I think he's got big problems. He would want to close things off by the end of the year. I don't think he will. I think there will be a peace gesture. I think it will fail. And then we'll be into a new ball game with the new American presidency.
You said a little earlier that President Zelensky was hanging on. His recent trip to the US, where he outlined this plan for victory to President Biden and the Democrat and Republican candidates, how do you think it went for him?
Not very well. It's the fickle media, Western media, that he's been a superstar for so long and a very, very good performer. And the thing is that while America is in a churn over many things in the election campaign, and we forget it's really about the election campaign, and then they've got the aggravation of matters in the Middle East and for Israel particularly not going at all well. Oh, do we want to go on and on with Zelensky? But what colours both crises? Unfortunately, there is no plan. There is no strategic plan. This is what became quite apparent from the various discussions and meetings at the United Nations General Assembly, which is a sort of great cattle market of ideas and alliances and deals behind in what used to be smoke-filled corridors and rooms, but you're not allowed to smoke anymore. But in fact, very little constructive came out of that. And it was quite clear what Zelensky needs in the medium and long term, which actually is not necessarily military. It's how they can stabilize the country, stabilize civil society and the economy that it can survive. Putin thinks that he can go on with his course of just wreckage at the moment, taking a wrecking ball to the economy. We're seeing that with the trashing of infrastructure. It's 50% things like utilities like water, electricity of what it was in February 22. So things are pretty bad. The people are exhausted. But the bit that hasn't got through to Moscow is that the train has left the station. Ukraine, even if it's a wrecked, in part, conquered territory, is not going to rejoin Putin and Putinism and the Putin-Russia dream. It's going to hold out, and it will be a holdout for a very long time, whether Zelensky is there or not. Now, if I can just add to that, Europe doesn't seem to have a plan to match that. Yes, it's going to subsidize this. Yes, it's going to put in a certain amount of ammunition, arms, and so forth. And things that we focused on, like whether the deep strike aerial launched weapons, namely Scalp, Storm Shadow, Taurus, would actually be fired or not, is almost a sideshow to this. It's the long-term stability of Ukraine, which the Frontline arc, which actually goes from the Netherlands through to Denmark, the Scandinavians, the Baltics, Poland, and Finland above all, saying, look, you've got to get real. We are in a position of confrontation with Russia now, and you can't walk away from it. And you can see this from meetings like the G7, like NATO, even some of the EU summits with very noisy dissidents like Hungary. That they are not focusing enough on what Zelensky was looking for was a 3-4 year stabilization plan, of which the military part would be very, very important, of course, because it's got to be able to defend itself. And this is where it's almost as if nothing's happened over the past 2.5 years. And we know a lot has happened and 1 million lives have been lost. The interesting thing is that the American media have gone cool on Zelensky. And I think it was noticeable during his recent visit to the United States. You know, there was a lot of editorial saying, oh, it's not quite a good thing for the long term. I think he's tough enough to last until Christmas and the New Year, but I'm afraid to say I don't think he'll be around over much through next year. He must be physically exhausted, amongst other things. And there will be a redrawing of the Ukrainian strategy, and it's going to need a lot of help from outside. I don't think it's getting much from the collective editorials of the English language press at the moment.
An article in The Economist argues that for Ukraine and its backers to win, they first have to admit that they are losing at the moment. Do you agree with that?
It is, but I'm very fed up with The Economist, I must say. I'll be straight out about it. They've been pompous. They've been very, very smug, in which they've been giving advice to the Ukrainian leadership, military and civil, as if that they're the last resort of wisdom, and they have got plenty of things wrong.
What do you make of the arguments, though, that a new approach to victory should be explored? Do you think that President Zelensky's maximalist ambitions are still possible to regain all the land that Russia has taken since 2014? Or if not, is there a compromise that can be done to end the war that is favourable to Ukraine?
I think even he and his generals realised the maximalist approach of recovering all the lands, including Crimea. Certainly, I think that's gone. But even Luhansk and Donetsk, no, I don't think it's possible. And realism is setting in, or has set in for a long time behind the scenes. But they've got to try and get the most they can to stabilise. And there will be some messy peace deal. We've seen it with the Minsk agreements, 2014, 2015, never got anywhere. And recently, Putin's team, people like Lavrov and Medvedev, have said, oh, of course, we did have peace talks, which is true, feelers in Istanbul last year, the year before, but they get nowhere. A peace conversation, which will take place, is part of Putin's war plan. I think there will be a messy truce somewhere along the line, but you've asked me whether it's going to bring peace, and it won't. I think that we've got a very long-term conflict which will freeze and thaw and blow up. And the fact is that this is the thing of our time. Frozen conflicts that blow up, there are too many of them. And that is the real test for the Western alliance. But sorry, to go back to The Economist again, they have recommended that Zelensky's Ukraine should be admitted to NATO forthwith. I really don't see that as realistic or possible, because it would set a terrible precedent saying, oh, we're going to admit you in a time of war, therefore we cannot give you the full guarantees of membership. In other words, Article 5, an attack on one member of the alliance is an attack on all, and we will respond. It just doesn't work like that. I can't see how they're going to broker this one.
Russia has just marked the anniversary of the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, but it has been muted. Why is that?
I think Putin must be concerned about what public reaction is. There hasn't been overmuch so far, because such is the total control of above ground media, that is telly and newspapers and the agencies. But stuff gets about. And if they really have taken 610,000 killed, maimed, missing, and otherwise wounded and returning, this is going to have an effect. And so he knows he's got to be careful there. He's being careful too about his allies, which I think there's a certain amount of desperation that he feels he's got to use more. Belarus, particularly, there is urgency behind the political interference in Georgia. But above all, the sort of very odd coupling is Russia and Iran. And it looks as if Russia really did need constant resupply and upgrades of the Shahid class of drones, and above all, the kind of missiles like the F-88 360s that have been going in as a reply, as a riposte, as a match for HIMARS. Does Russia really need this? Well, apparently, yes. And we've got this enormous defense industry and the enormous defense economy, but it isn't delivering a lot of high quality goods. Now, having said that about Iran, where Iran is in the Middle East and what has been going on with Hezbollah, what is the request from Tehran to Moscow now? What are they looking for a help? And it's a big question, because there's a lot of co-production, there's a lot of shared activity, very big strategic area, which is space and cyber, but space and satellites, which the Russians and the Iranians do together.
Yeah, the Russian Prime Minister was in Tehran striking a gas supply deal as Iran prepared to launch this ballistic missile attack on Israel. How do you think that events in the Middle East are going to change or influence their relationship, and as a consequence, influence perhaps the direction of the war in Ukraine?
I think it will affect that, but because there's one thing that really it's underreported and it's quite difficult to follow. Ukraine has shown great skill in developing its own weapons, and it looks as if it's got a set, not particularly highly developed in volume, I mean, not many of them, of deep strike weapons. And what does seem to have an effect, if you follow the above ground reporting from things like the Institute for the Study of War, it's very difficult. They are blowing into Russia's ammunition stocks in a big way in terms of artillery ammunition. But 6 weeks ago, the advantage of Russia was 20 shells to every one of the Ukraine. That's medium 155, 152 caliber, the standard caliber. And Russia has been getting quite a bit from North Korea. Now it's down to something like 3-1 or even 2-1. So it is having a hell of an effect. And that's why I think there will be a concerted move. I think Putin must be praying for a Trump presidency, but he's actually betting more on a Vance presidency. And the first thing that he would want that to do, if it comes in January, is to get rid of Zelenskyy, because Zelenskyy is still keeping the fighting spirit go. If they can remove Zelenskyy, which Trump more or less seems to be pledged to do, I think that would be a tremendous psychological blow for Putin. It's getting very, very messy indeed.
The new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has taken up office this week. I know you're a fan. How influential do you think he's likely to be in keeping minds focused on Ukraine, despite this preoccupation at the moment with the immediate prospect of all-out war in the Middle East?
Yeah, I'm quite fixated on Mark Rutte. I wouldn't describe myself as a fan. I'm quite critical in some respects. But
All right, fixated. We'll settle on fixated.
He was a very successful Netherlands Prime Minister in extremely difficult circumstances, and headed off some very nasty migration, racial-based problems. He's quite a cautious man. He watches the whole game. You won't have so much Scandinavian in your face as you had with Stoltenberg, and to an extent with Rasmussen. He is a great conciliator. He's a bit like the great Italian banker Mario Draghi. He really knows the waterfront. He is deeply experienced. And like Mario Draghi, he's the sort of person who always gives the impression he doesn't really have to be there if he doesn't want to. And, that he's doing it out of a sense of service and duty. And I think that he may well prove one of the deep thinkers. But the interaction which is going to be so important with him, and he, I think, will turn out to be the senior brain in this, funny enough, is the relationship with Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron. Because Macron must recognize that Rutte is going to be around for a lot longer than he. And he talks a lot about strategy for Ukraine. But he knows that Rutte will get together a team in NATO behind the scenes to really put a plan together. He's a super realist. That's the thing to realize about him. He's quite unusual, and he's absolutely the kind of politician that is so much needed in Europe now, because he can think beyond national barriers. I think he'd get very interested, by the way, in things like the Middle East, the migrant problem. I think the Southerners will actually get a much better deal from him than they did from Stoltenberg.
Can you be a super realist about the potential consequences for Ukraine in the outcome of the US election? Can you paint the picture for me of a Kamala Harris win or a Donald Trump win?
I think it's a turn down on Reglo 5 for with either win. There will be much less enthusiasm. Kamala Harris presidency would be far more focused on the west coast of America and its problems, and will become possibly even obsessive about China and the China threat, particularly in cyber, because it's the one thing where she's really come alive when she's been talking about defense, resilience, and security. So don't think you're going to get any advantage there. You might do in that she would bow to a very experienced Pentagon military and diplomatic team who are now very, very well versed in the Ukraine problem. Trump, I think, I don't fear so much because I think he's so all over the place, noticeably, that his concentration span may not be broad enough to do serious damage in Ukraine. Putin, it seems to me, from way back, was thinking more about a Harris presidency than Trump. He doesn't see Trump necessarily as his big friend, and one knows from conferences he's been at where he's wont to give stage whispers. He thinks Trump's a bit of a clown, frankly. So I think that it will be the establishment, but it won't be such a radical shift from what we're seeing now, but there's certainly going to be fewer weapons, there's going to be less money, and there's going to be much less enthusiasm either way, Harris or Trump.
And you talked earlier about how you think the war in Ukraine will go on for quite some time yet. What are you going to be looking for in the coming months to indicate how this war might actually end?
It's when they go to lines. I think they'll go to hardened lines as the winter comes on. That you will get the extravagant claims of Putin to take over not only Luhansk and Donetsk, but Zaporizhia, Melitopol. There will be some kind of declaration of aspiration to annex as far west as Kherson. What they will do about Odessa and the Black Sea, that is a big, big question mark. And I think that that's where Zelensky will have support, that the Allies will want to ensure that the Black Sea stays open. So therefore, we've got that. What happens on the northeast of the battle is going to be very interesting indeed, whether the Russians will feel it is an urgent priority to get the Ukrainians out of Kursk, and what is going to happen in Belarus, as I say. And then I'm going to add another thing, which is a great unknown in two respects, is nuclear. The instability of nuclear plants, I think, really does become a really big problem. The IEA is flagging it up. They're not being listened to very much. It's the plants in Kursk Oblast as well. And Zaporizhia, the big Zaporizhia plant is still very unstable. On the other hand, militarily, is what notice should we take of Putin and Putin's people announcing a change in their nuclear doctrine? You may recall just very recently, they have said that if they're fired on Russian territory in depth by a depth weapon like Storm Shadow, provided by a NATO ally, then that NATO ally, it would be legitimate to respond to that NATO ally with a nuclear weapon. Kind of weird, isn't it? But that's the way of thinking. They're thinking he won't do it, but he is getting very antsy on the nuclear front. And to go one further, the thing that is worrying Space Command in the US and the UK is that they are talking seriously of abrogating the deep space security, the Space Security Treaty of 1967, by which all parties agreed not to militarize space. Actually, with Iran, they're talking about military and even attack satellites. Russia is even talking about putting a nuclear weapon into space.
So, Robert, if you take a step back with everything you've said and the security issues that you've mentioned, the situation in the Middle East, China will be watching all of this as well to see how it plans to move on any designs it has on Taiwan and Ukraine. I mean, where are you assessing the biggest security risk at the moment globally to Europe and NATO?
I think it has to be from the Middle East, because this could, it has the potential to explode in so many different directions. Let's take it seems to be quite a contained one, but it isn't, is the Houthi attacks on shipping. They are more successful, they're more varied, they're more sophisticated as they go on, and the response from the two missions, the Prosperity Guardian and Aspedes, the EU one, are less successful. There's that, but there is the fact that Israel is now fighting on 5 fronts. The exchange of missiles is really very serious, and if they do go for broke for sensitive military sites, like, or even nuclear sites, or a major oil site, I think then it becomes a global crisis and a very wide regional conflict. That is the biggest problem. And that is deflecting attention from Ukraine. They've got to get on top of Ukraine, because Russia has now made Ukraine a way of war, and that's the way this regime thinks. And the regime will get tougher as it faces more economic difficulties at home, because the economy is overheated. There's too many personnel are being involved in this, between 4 and 5 million, and the state of health of the nation, quite physically, it's visibly declining. And I think that when Putin gets into trouble, he gets desperate.
Robert Fox, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you. Thank you for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or listen to Times Radio, or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye for now.